Imagine this. It's April 1945. But the war doesn't end the way you know it ended. Instead, imagine New York City. A normal spring morning, people are going to work, reading newspapers about the Allied advance into Germany, feeling confident that victory is just weeks away. And then, high above the Atlantic, something appears that shouldn't exist. A sleek silver aircraft, moving faster than anything the Americans have ever seen, skipping along the edge of space like a stone across water. It's called the Silbervogel, the Silverbird, a suborbital spaceplane, and it's carrying a single bomb. The plane releases its payload over Manhattan, the bomb falls, and in an instant thousands of people who thought they were safe, 3,000 miles from the nearest battlefield, are gone. This never happened, but the blueprints were real, the engineers who designed it were real, and some of the technology they imagined in Nazi Germany is flying over our heads right now, 7 decades later, in the form of hypersonic missiles, stealth bombers, and spacecraft. So here are the questions I want you to think about as we go through this story. How close did Hitler's wonder weapons really come to changing the war? What happened to the scientists who designed them, the men who built terror weapons and used slave labor to do it? And how much of today's military technology is still living in the shadow of ideas first tested in the labs of the Third Reich? Because the answers might make you very uncomfortable. In the last years of World War II, as Nazi Germany faced overwhelming Allied superiority in men, tanks, ships, and aircraft, Adolf Hitler became obsessed with a single idea: Wunderwaffe, wonder weapons, miracle weapons, technology so advanced, so terrifying, that they could reverse Germany's fortunes and force the Allies to negotiate peace, or even deliver outright victory. It wasn't just propaganda, it was real. Germany had some of the most advanced scientists and engineers in the world, and they were given nearly unlimited resources, at least in theory, to create weapons no one had ever seen before. On the Baltic coast, in a place called Peenemünde, the Nazis built what was essentially a secret high-tech city: laboratories, test stands for rockets, airfields, wind tunnels, modern housing for scientists and engineers. It looked like the future, clean, orderly, advanced. But just a few miles away, there were concentration camps and forced labor sites where prisoners, Jews, Poles, Soviet POWs, were worked to death building the weapons their captors believed would win the war. Thousands of engineers and physicists worked at Peenemünde and facilities like it. Many were brilliant. Some were true believers in Nazism. Others were careerists who saw an opportunity to work on cutting-edge science with funding they'd never get in peacetime. And all of them were building weapons designed to kill as many people as possible, as efficiently as possible. The lead scientist at Peenemünde was a man named Wernher von Braun. He was 30 years old in 1942, charismatic, ambitious, and obsessed with rockets. He dreamed of space travel, of sending humans to the moon, to Mars, beyond. But to fund that dream, he built weapons. And the weapon that made him famous was the V-2 rocket. The V-2 was the first long-range ballistic missile in history. It stood 46 feet tall, weighed 12 tons, and could carry a 1-ton warhead over 200 miles. It flew faster than the speed of sound, reaching altitudes of 50 miles, higher than any aircraft of the time. And because it was supersonic, you couldn't hear it coming. No air raid siren, no warning, just an explosion, and then the sound of the rocket arriving seconds later. Imagine you're in London in late 1944. The war has been going well for the Allies. D-Day succeeded. Paris has been liberated. Everyone believes Germany is finished. And then, one afternoon, you're walking down the street, and without warning, the building next to you explodes. A massive crater appears. Dozens of people are dead. And there's no explanation. No bomber overhead. No engine noise. Just sudden, inexplicable destruction. That's what the V-2 felt like. It felt like being bombed by the future. Over the course of the war, Germany launched over 3,000 V-2 rockets, mostly at London and Antwerp. They killed about 9,000 people, far fewer than conventional bombing, but the psychological impact was enormous. People felt helpless. There was no defense, no way to shoot it down. You just had to hope it didn't land on you. But here's what's important. The V-2 wasn't just a terror weapon, it was a proof of concept. It proved that you could build a machine that could leave the atmosphere, travel hundreds of miles, and hit a target with devastating force. That idea, that technology, didn't die when Germany surrendered. It became the foundation for every ballistic missile, every space rocket, every ICBM that exists today. The V-2 didn't win the war, but it won the future. The V-2 wasn't the only wonder weapon. There was also the V-1, the buzz bomb, which was essentially the world's first cruise missile. It was a small, pilotless aircraft powered by a pulse jet engine that made a distinctive buzzing sound, hence the nickname. The V-1 flew low and slow compared to the V-2, which meant it could be shot down by anti-aircraft fire or fighter planes. But it was cheap to produce and could be launched in large numbers. Over 10,000 were fired at Britain. If you were in London during the V-1 attacks, you learned to listen for the engine. As long as you could hear the buzz, you were safe. But when the engine cut out, when the fuel ran out and the bomb started its dive, that's when you ran. You had maybe 10 seconds before impact. One British civilian later described it like this: you'd be having tea or reading the paper, and you'd hear the buzz, and everyone would freeze, and then the silence, and you'd just pray that it wasn't coming down on your street. Again, the V-1 didn't change the outcome of the war, but it proved that you could build an unmanned guided weapon that could fly hundreds of miles and hit a city. Today, we call that a cruise missile. The Tomahawk, the Calibre. The concept is the same, the lineage is direct, but these were the weapons that actually got deployed. There were others, far more advanced, far more terrifying, that almost made it into the war, and if they had, the death toll, the duration, and maybe even the outcome could have been very different. Let me tell you about the Me-262. The Messerschmitt Me-262 was the world's first operational jet fighter. It entered service in 1944, and it was unlike anything the Allies had ever seen. It could fly at 540 miles per hour, 100 miles per hour faster than the best Allied fighters. It had 4 30mm cannons that could rip a bomber apart in seconds, and because it was so fast, it was almost impossible to intercept. Allied pilots who encountered the Me-262 described it as unfair. One American P-51 Mustang pilot said, "You'd see this thing streak past you, and by the time you turned your head, it was gone. You couldn't catch it. You couldn't outmaneuver it. All you could do was hope it didn't come back for another pass." If Germany had mass-produced the Me-262 earlier, if they'd focused on using it as an interceptor to defend German cities from Allied bombers, the air war over Europe could have been far more costly for the Allies. The bombing campaign that crippled German industry might have been slowed or even stopped. But Hitler interfered. He insisted that the Me-262 be used as a bomber, not a fighter. He wanted it to strike back at Britain, to terrorize civilians, not to defend Germany. By the time the Luftwaffe was allowed to use it properly, it was too late. Germany didn't have the fuel, the pilots, or the infrastructure to deploy it at scale. Still, the Me-262 shot down over 500 Allied aircraft before the war ended, and after the war both the United States and the Soviet Union rushed to capture Me-262s, study them, and use the technology to build their own jet fighters. The jets you see today, the F-16, the MiG-29, the Eurofighter, they all owe something to the Me-262. The swept-wing designs, the high-speed aerodynamics, the jet propulsion systems, all of it traces back in part to what German engineers figured out in the 1940s. And then there were the projects that never quite made it, but should have terrified the Allies even more. The Horten Ho-229, for example. A jet-powered flying wing that looked like something out of science fiction. It had no fuselage, no tail, just a smooth, seamless wing with engines embedded inside. It was designed to be fast, have long range, and this is key, have a very low radar cross-section. In other words, it was an early attempt at stealth. Only a handful of prototypes were built before the war ended, but when the Americans captured one and tested it decades later, they found that its radar signature was indeed significantly smaller than conventional aircraft of the time. The Horten Ho-229 looks eerily similar to modern stealth bombers like the B-2 Spirit. That's not a coincidence. There was also the Arado 234, the world's first operational jet bomber. There were projects for vertical takeoff aircraft. There were guided surface-to-air missiles, like the Wasserfall, which was essentially a small V-2 rocket designed to shoot down Allied bombers. If it had been deployed in large numbers, it could have been the first effective long-range SAM system, decades before the Soviet S-75 or the American Nike. And then there were the truly insane ideas. The America Bomber Project, a long-range bomber designed to fly from Germany to New York, drop a bomb and return. Several designs were proposed, including the Silbervogel I mentioned at the beginning, a rocket-powered spaceplane that would skip along the upper atmosphere like a stone on water, striking targets in North America before gliding back to a base in occupied territory. It never got past the design stage. But the fact that German engineers were even thinking about suborbital bombers in 1944 tells you how far ahead, at least conceptually, they were. So here's the question. Could these weapons have actually changed the war? Most serious historians say no. They couldn't have delivered victory. Germany was facing the combined industrial might of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Even if every wonder weapon had worked perfectly, Germany simply didn't have the resources, the manpower, or the time to turn the tide. But, and this is important, they could have prolonged the war. They could have made the Allied bombing campaign far more costly. They could have delayed D-Day. They could have killed tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, more people before the end. If Germany had focused less on offensive terror weapons like the VK-2 and more on defensive systems, integrated radar, guided missiles, jet interceptors, the air war over Germany might have looked very different. The Allies might have lost far more bombers. The strategic bombing campaign might have been slowed or stopped. And if that had happened, the invasion of Europe might have been delayed. The war might have dragged on into 1946, and that means more people dying in concentration camps, more civilians killed in bombings, more soldiers killed on every front. So no, the wonder weapons probably couldn't have won the war, but they could have made the horror last longer. Now I want you to think about this. If you had been in charge of German strategy in 1943, knowing only what they knew then, would you have bet everything on miracle weapons? Or would you have focused on more conventional systems, more tanks, more fighters, more submarines? Because that's the gamble Hitler took, and he lost. But what if he'd been right? When the war ended in May 1945, the race was on to capture Germany's scientists, engineers, and technology before the Soviets could get to them. Wernher von Braun and his team at Peenemünde saw the writing on the wall. They knew Germany was finished, and they had a choice: surrender to the Soviets, who would likely execute or imprison them, or surrender to the Americans, who might see their value. Von Braun chose the Americans. In the final weeks of the war, he and about 500 of his top engineers made their way south and surrendered to US forces. They brought with them truckloads of documents, blueprints, and hardware, everything the Americans would need to continue their work. And the Americans were very interested. Under a program called Operation Paperclip, the US government secretly brought over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians to work on American military and aerospace projects. Their Nazi pasts were quietly sanitized, war crimes were overlooked, memberships in the Nazi Party were erased from official records. Wernher von Braun, the man who had overseen the construction of the V-2 using slave labor from concentration camps, was given a comfortable life in Alabama, working for the US Army on rocket development. By the 1960s, he was a celebrity, the public face of NASA, the man who built the Saturn V rocket that carried American astronauts to the moon. Think about that for a moment. The same mind that designed a weapon to terrorize London also designed the rocket that made the Apollo 11 mission possible. Now, here's where it gets morally complicated, and I want you to wrestle with this because there's no easy answer. On one hand, von Braun and his colleagues were brilliant. Their knowledge of rocketry was decades ahead of anyone else in the world. If the United States hadn't taken them, the Soviet Union would have. And the Soviets did take hundreds of other German scientists and used them to build their own missile and space programs. So you could argue this was pragmatic. This was necessary. We had to have that knowledge to win the Cold War, to reach the moon, to maintain our security. But on the other hand, these men built weapons that killed thousands of civilians. They used slave labor, prisoners from concentration camps like Mittelbau-Dora, where over 20,000 people died in brutal conditions. And after the war, they were rewarded. They got jobs, salaries, respect, even fame. Is that justice? Is that acceptable? I don't know, but I want you to tell me what you think in the comments. Would you have made the same decision if your country had the chance to gain a huge technological advantage by hiring former enemy scientists, even if some of them had blood on their hands? Would you take it? Because that's the choice the United States made, and so did the Soviet Union. And both countries used that knowledge to build the weapons and spacecraft that shaped the second half of the 20th century. Let me show you how deep the shadow goes. The V-1 buzz bomb, that's the ancestor of every cruise missile in service today. The Tomahawk, the Caliber. The concept is identical. A small pilotless aircraft that flies to a target and explodes. The V-2 rocket, that's the ancestor of every ballistic missile and space launch vehicle. The Soviet R-7 that launched Sputnik was based on VT-2 technology. The American Redstone rocket that launched Alan Shepard into space was designed by Wernher von Braun's team, using knowledge they brought from Peenemünde. The Saturn V that went to the moon, same lineage. The Me-262 and other German jet designs influenced every jet fighter and bomber that came after. The swept-wing designs you see on modern aircraft. The Germans figured that out first. The Horten Ho 229 flying wing. Look at the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. Look at the new B-21 Raider. The resemblance isn't accidental. The principles of stealth, reducing radar cross-section, smooth surfaces, embedded engines, were being explored in Nazi Germany in the 1940s. The early guided missiles, like the Wasserfall or the Fritz X guided bomb, were the ancestors of modern surface-to-air missiles and precision-guided munitions. Even the concept of the ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile capable of striking another continent, was first seriously explored by German engineers. They didn't build one, but they thought about it. They sketched it. They calculated whether it was possible. And 20 years later, both the United States and the Soviet Union had ICBMs. And the Cold War became a standoff where both sides could destroy each other in less than an hour. So when you see a modern military parade, when you watch a rocket launch, when you read about hypersonic missiles or stealth bombers, remember where a lot of those ideas came from. Not all of it, of course. Innovation happened everywhere. But a significant portion of modern military and aerospace technology has roots in the labs, the test stands, and the wind tunnels of Nazi Germany. And that raises an uncomfortable question. Can technology be separated from the regime that created it? When we admire the engineering of a Saturn V rocket, are we obliged to remember that the man who designed it also designed the V-2, a weapon that killed thousands of civilians? When we celebrate the moon landing, do we also have to acknowledge that it was built, in part, on knowledge gained through slave labor and war crimes? I don't have an easy answer, but I think we have to ask the question. Now I want to talk directly to you because this story isn't just about the past, it's about the choices we make today. Do you think Hitler's wonder weapons could ever have truly won the war, or do you think they could only have stretched out the killing, made the nightmare last longer, cost more lives? Leave a comment. Tell me what you think. And here's another one. Should the scientists behind weapons like the VT-2, the men who used slave labor, who built terror weapons, should they have been put on trial at Nuremberg? Or was it acceptable to hire them, as both the United States and the Soviet Union did, because the knowledge they had was too valuable to lose? Would you have made that call? If you'd been sitting in a Pentagon office in 1945 and someone handed you a file on Wernher von Braun, would you have said, arrest him or hire him? And here's the hardest question. When you look at modern missiles, stealth bombers and rockets, technologies that protect us, that explore space, that define modern military power, do you see pure progress? Or do you see the lingering shadow of a nightmare that began in the labs of the Third Reich? I want you to think about that, and I want you to tell me in the comments. Because this isn't ancient history. The scientists who worked at Peenemünde, some of them died only a few decades ago. The last V2 veterans are still alive. The technologies they pioneered are still evolving. And the moral questions, the questions about genius and complicity, about whether we can use knowledge gained through atrocity, about whether the ends justify the means, those questions are still unresolved. Let me leave you with one final thought. In 1969, when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon, the man responsible for getting them there, Wernher von Braun, watched from mission control. He was celebrated as a hero, a visionary, the man who made the impossible possible. But in the back of his mind, did he think about Mittelbau Dora? Did he think about the prisoners who died building the V2? Did he think about the civilians in London who were killed by the weapons he designed? We don't know. He rarely spoke about it. When he was asked, he said he regretted the suffering, but that his dream had always been space, and the weapons were just a means to an end. Is that enough? Is it acceptable to build horrors in the pursuit of a dream? If the dream eventually comes true, I want you to think about that. And I want you to tell me, do you think we made the right choice, bringing men like von Braun to America? Or do you think we crossed a line that should never have been crossed? And when you look at modern technology, at the satellites overhead, at the missiles in silos, at the rockets launching astronauts to the International Space Station, do you see progress? Or do you see the shadow of something darker, something we've never fully reckoned with? Let me know in the comments. Because this story, Hitler's wonder weapons, the scientists who built them, and the technology that grew from their work, this story isn't over. It's still unfolding. It's still shaping our world. And whether that's a triumph or a tragedy might depend on where you're standing and what you're willing to accept.